So there's one other thing I should have mentioned in the myth of Sisyphus, and that's a reference to yet another Dostoevsky character. This one is Stavrogan, who appears in the novel The Possessed, or The Devils, the same one in which Kirillov, that we talked about before, appears. So Stavrogan is almost a kind of a figurehead leader of the revolutionary group in the Russian town that we also mentioned. So he's a young Russian aristocrat, very handsome and dashing, intelligent, with many social graces and accomplishments, almost a kind of a Byronic figure. And the revolutionaries are very glad to have him as a leader. He's not really the ideological leader or the organisational leader. That's another character called Verkovensky, who's depicted as a kind of a despicable sort of person. But the revolutionaries are happy to see Stavrogan as their representative in the public eye, and Stavrogan consents to be seen that way by them, although he actually regards the revolutionaries with a certain amount of contempt, and regards himself with a certain amount of contempt too, it seems. But the point is, at the end of the novel, the Devils, there's a passage called Stavrogan's Confession, and apparently in the first edition of the novel, when the novel was released, the publisher refused to include Stavrogan's Confession because there was something so scandalous in it. But Dostoevsky later insisted on putting it back in. But in that confession, Stavrogan talks about how he's basically gone so far down the track of living, perhaps according to his own will or whatever, that he openly admits that he's engaged in child abuse, child sexual abuse, in fact. And so he speaks about that openly and hates himself for doing it, I suppose, but yet can't see that in a way that there was any way he could have avoided that. So how that comes out in the myth of Sisyphus, again reading from page 59 of the Penguin edition. So Camus saying, the freedom of absurd man is to live not best, but the most he can. So he's got to get as much experience to whatever he can while he's alive. It doesn't matter whether it's good necessarily or bad, but just to do it for the sake of doing it. And then he says, value judgments are discarded here in favour of factual judgments. Supposing that living in this way were not honourable, then true prophecy would command me to be dishonourable. And that's actually what Stavrogan says in the Dostoevsky novel. He says, I have chosen to live dishonourably. And he's got to then deal with that somehow. Anyway, so that's an important part of the myth of Sisyphus, but obviously we can't really leave the myth of Sisyphus behind without saying something about Sisyphus himself. That's who the whole thing's named after. So we know that Sisyphus was this character in Greek mythology who was condemned for some reason, I'm not sure what, to perpetually having to roll a big rock up a steep hill. When he nearly got to the top, the rock would roll away back down the hill and onto the plain, and Sisyphus would have to go back down, get it and roll it back up again. And that would just keep on going on endlessly. He would never finish the task because he would always have to go back and start again. So that was some punishment of the gods on Sisyphus. And there's a few other characters like that from Greek mythology that were used in European literature, particularly in the 19th century, like some of the early romantic poets like Byron and Shelley talked a lot about people like Prometheus and Manfred, who were people who had rebelled against the gods. The gods were kind of being a stand-in for God himself in the eyes of Byron and Shelley. But because of their rebellion against the gods, they were condemned to some perpetual, endless punishment. And Shelley and Byron both saw those characters as heroes, really. They identified with them. So Camus uses the character and the dilemma of Sisyphus as the nameplate for his book. But then it occurred to me just now, it seems odd that he would use that, because the whole problem that Sisyphus faced was this endless, repeated experience that he can't escape from. No matter how many times he repeats it, he has to go back and do it again. There's no end to it. But what Camus is talking about, and what Mercer, his character in The Outsider, is talking about, is the fact that experience comes to an abrupt end and there's no more. And that's what he's lamenting, the fact that we will cease to be, will cease to be alive, will cease to be conscious. It'll all happen, it will all come to an end and there's no more. So in a way he would prefer to be Sisyphus. And maybe that's what Camus meant. It would be better to continue to live doing something painful, difficult, boring, tedious, exhausting, but at least being alive. So perhaps that's what he meant when he used that analogy. I'm not sure, really. Anyway, so to kind of briefly sum up the myth of Sisyphus and the L'Étranger, or The Outsider, as I see it, what Camus is saying, I think, is, and what his characters are saying, we have this brief life, we know we're here, we know we're not going to be here soon, and that's the end, and there's no meaning to it, and it's just so hard to cope with that. But it seems to be the undercurrent that he's saying, and he doesn't actually say this outright, but this is how it seems to me. He's saying God is unfair, God is unjust. If he was going to make us, and make us self-aware and conscious, then why doesn't he let us continue to be? It's not fair that he should give us this experience, this human experience, and then suddenly just take it away and there's nothing more. And when people come up to him and say, well, but actually you're wrong, God doesn't take it away. He does. He gives us life and understanding and consciousness, but that will continue. He says we will live eternally, and that is part of the human condition, that we don't expire, we continue to be. But Camus says, no, that's not right. I don't accept that. That's not right. God doesn't do that. And in fact, I don't believe there is a God. And even if there were a God, and even if he did give us eternal life, I would reject him, because I just think he's capricious and unjust, and I wouldn't accept his being, and I wouldn't accept that gift of eternal life from him, even if he were there and even if he gave that life to me. That's how I mean, as I say, Camus doesn't state that in those terms, but I think that's the feeling I get from the whole book. And as we mentioned, we read a while ago the later book, written 12 or 15 years later, The Fall, and the character in that seems to have come to an understanding that there is a God, and there is a devil, and we have guilt. We can't blame everything on God, but we are guilty of things. So the Outsider, The Myth of Sisyphus, are some of his early books. The Fall is one of his last, if not the last. So what we're going to do next is look at The Rebel, which came in between, and the thinking in that kind of is in between as well, in a way. And interestingly, Stavrogan appears in that too, so we'll go on to that shortly. So to begin with The Rebel, this is really a philosophical treatise. So most of Camus' books were either the works of fiction in which ideas were worked out, but they were either novels or plays. The Myth of Sisyphus was an essay. This one is too, but much longer. So it's purely just dealing with ideas directly. It was published in 1951, so not long after the Second World War had finished. Russian communism, Soviet communism was still very much in full swing. So he's talking through the book about whether violence, killing, mass killing, is excusable, was justifiable to achieve some purpose in a way, and his results are somewhat surprising. As we said, they were aware at that time of what had happened, all the horrors of the Second World War. A lot of people knew what Soviet communism really was at that time in 1951, and Stalin was still alive, and the official exposures hadn't happened yet, but people that really were more honest could see what had been happening already for that time. Some didn't want to accept that fact. And later on, Camus got into a big row with his French philosophical colleague Jean-Paul Sartre on that subject, about whether the mass killings and slavery were justifiable to create a good society. We might look at that later on, that whole debate that occurred. Camus, being basically a humane person, didn't seem to feel that Stalinism could be justified. But in this book, where he looks at all of those things, he talks about people like the Marquis de Sade and the French Revolution and Robespierre and the guillotine and all those and many other things like that. Surprisingly, he seems to feel that they were justified, but we'll go into more detail about that. So it's he doesn't always say the things that one expects he might say. And being a philosopher, he likes to define his terms in his own way, and that's often quite surprising and hard to understand. So there's a lot in the book, and it's going to be hard to get through it all. And if anyone's actually watching any of these programs, they may get tired of it after a while, and I probably will get tired of it too, so we might have to have a break part of the way through. But anyway, I think it's worth looking at, and if for no other reason, if I decide to write a book about it later, I'll have all this material to go back to look at. Anyway, so the book itself is divided into 5 main chapters. So he has an introduction in which he again talks about the idea of the absurd, and then he defines what he regards as a rebel. So as we mentioned, that's not what you and I might think of a rebel, but he's got his own particular way of looking at that. And then he talks about what he calls metaphysical rebellion, the sort of underlying philosophies of why one can refuse to obey or choose to go one's own way. And then he talks about historical rebellion, so he goes into a lot of detail about some of the historical events where people have overthrown regimes and set up their own. There's a lot of material there. And then he talks about rebellion and art. How novels, we know of his interest in Dostoevsky, but particularly how people like that have looked into this. And then what he calls thought at the meridian, so whether murder, mass murder are justifiable in any way. So we're going to run out of time in this episode, so just to begin with, basically, in his introduction, he just goes back to his theme of what the absurd is, which we've looked at in Stranger or The Outsider rather, and The Myth of Sisyphus. And we've stated what his idea of the absurd is, and then he says again there that the absurd can lead to either suicide or murder. And of course we looked at that with Meursault, who committed murder. He perhaps did that to bring about his own execution, which was a form of suicide. And then we looked at people like Kirillov in Dostoevsky's The Possessed, who chose to kill himself to somehow achieve freedom from death. So that's what the introduction is about. He's reiterating some of those themes we've looked at, and how suicide or murder can be the logical outcomes of that absurd philosophy, which, and we looked at this again before, saying the absurd is probably not true anyway, but he believed it was. So we probably might have to leave that there and then go on in the next episode to his first chapter, where he defines what a rebel is.